morning to everybody. My name is Andrea Davis for newbies that haven't actually taken part in any of our webinars before. I am joined today by our expert trainer, David Wells, and he will be delivering this morning's session on total supply considerations. Does your supply chain deliver your objectives? We will be with you for about 1 hour. The slides will be sent to you after today's session, along with the recording when that has been edited and it's ready to go. Just to let you know that this session is being recorded, you know, that you can pass that on to your contacts, colleagues, whoever it is, so it doesn't actually have to stay within your organisation. If you want to send that out externally, that is absolutely fine as well. We do have time for Q&A at the very end, but please feel free to ask David questions throughout. Share your experiences, any comments, you know, challenge David if you want to. I'm sure he won't mind that. So we want to try and make this engaging, very engaging for you all. So please feel free to use the chat box at the top of the screen if you want to share your comments. Just a little bit about the Civil Service College for those that haven't actually taken part in our webinars before. This is our UK footprint. So who is the Civil Service College? Where are we based? We are an independent training organisation that offers training solutions to the UK civil service and the wider public sector. We have delivered training to not just central government departments, such as the Cabinet Office, DEFRA and DWP, but also devolved administrations like the Welsh Government and, of course, our NHS as well as local authorities. We are actually based, our office is based in the heart of Whitehall in Westminster, right near St James's Park. So when the lockdown lifts, when travel permits, please do come in and see us. We want people back in the classroom. We will be continuing our virtual learning and, of course, our webinars, but we just want to see faces. So please do come and see us in the classroom as well. Not only do we work in the UK, but of course, we work internationally as well. So you can actually see our global footprint here. For any international participants today, if you do have any training requirements, any training questions, whether that's for training here in the UK or overseas in your country, please do approach me at the end of the webinar. I will put my email address in there for you, so we can actually have that conversation. Fingers crossed when travel permits, who knows when that will be, but yes, we will welcome you all with open arms when that is allowed. So just a bit about our course categories and services. We offer, I think it's around about 70 to 100 different courses at the moment, both face-to-face and virtual. So you can see here from accountability and governance to leadership and management, professional development, policy, law and legal, media, digital and data, finance and commercial, and equality, diversity and inclusion, which is probably one of our newest categories. So if there's any categories on there that you'd like to find out more about, please do visit our website at www.civilservicecollege.org.uk. Okay, so David is one of our expert trainers. I've worked with David for a couple of years now. We do miss having him in the classroom, but it's his first virtual session, his first virtual webinar with Civil Service College. So just a bit about David. He is a finance and comes from a finance and procurement background with over 40 years experience working in local government and with over 30 years in management roles. He was head of finance in the technical services department at Barking and Dagenham Borough Council in London, later heading up a corporate team in the Chief Executive's Department with overall responsibilities for the competitive tendering process across the authority. Dave later joined the Finance Directorate and project managed the installation of a replacement IT system for the borough's financial, personnel and payroll functions. Latterly, he became Assistant Director and oversaw the management of payroll, pensions, human resources and accounts, IT development, secretariat and departmental policy and administration. More recently, Dave has worked as a public sector advisor, supporting UK central and local government, focused on financial and budget management, procurement, contracting and contract management, including work with the health sector as well. So a big hello to you, David. Welcome. I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm going to pass this straight on to you to take the platform. There you go.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and good morning, everybody. I forgot to tell Andrea that she should have added to that slide my work with a lot of overseas governments as well, but I won't bore you with all that.
Not at all.
What we're going to try and do today is to give you a flavour of a number of these things. In 45 to 50 minutes, we really can't hope to cover everything in the time, but my key objective for this morning is to look at a number of areas so that you get a further flavour of really what needs to be thought out and what needs to be looked at in detail. During the session this morning, I'll be encouraging participation. As Andrea has said, we'd like questions, please, and preferably via the chat room or the Q&A sessions. And I did mention, I don't know if I was on an open microphone, but I did mention to Andrea that if we can't get round to all the questions in time, I will follow them up afterwards with a reply, and Andrea or one of her colleagues can forward that to you after the event. I'm going to ask Andrea to press the slide forward button because for some reason my laptop won't enable me to do this. So during the session we'll have a look at the supply chain and the considerations around supply, what those parts in the chain are. Hopefully at the end of it there'll be a better understanding of supply chain management. Relationships. I think relationships tend to be forgotten about or overlooked, and understanding those relationships and how to build them, how to maintain them, again, a key area. A brief look at supply in a crisis, and certainly in the last 12 months we've had a crisis, haven't we?
12 months today. 12 months today.
It is, yes, 12 months today. I just remind everybody that 12 o'clock we are being asked to remember all of those that have passed, so we should be having a minute's silence. We won't be on here, but of course back to your workplaces or back to your homes. Next slide please, Andrea. Other areas we're going to just have a look at. At the end I'm going to try and highlight areas that you need to review, or in my view you need to review when we are looking at your supply chain. We'll have a look at what could go wrong, have a look at what might hit the ultimate deliverables, whether these are services or whether these are sort of physical items. When the supply chain fails, how that can hit the deliverables, what some of the risks might be. And I mean, you could spend a whole week looking at procurement risk and supply risk, so you'll realize that in 45, 50 minutes we can't really do a great deal, but I'm going to highlight some of the key things for you, and we're going to try and look at the end-to-end consideration of that supply chain and how we can use that to meet our overall objectives in an organization. Next slide please. First of all, when we think about supply, when we think about procurement, let's go back to basics. What are we buying? Where we are buying generally one or more of these things on this note. We're buying goods, physical things. We're buying perhaps people skills. We might be buying consultants. We might be buying building works, maintenance works, gardening works, all sorts of works activities. And generally, we would buy these through either a one-off purchase or a contract for something larger or for something longer. So that's the sort of background that the supply chain is linking in with. I've noticed that more and more in the press, certainly in the UK this year or in this last year, we've had lots of references to the supply chain, and I do wonder whether the media understand what we mean by supply chain. It's certainly a key element within the procurement process or within the contracting process to get that supply chain right, because if we don't, then as we'll discover, things could go quite horribly wrong. Next slide, please. What benefits do we get from either contracts or orders? Well, if we're going into a contract, there is a security for both the client, the purchaser, and for the supplier as well, because it sets out, it's a legal contract. It sets out what's expected of both parties, when you might get things, what quality there is, what recourse we have if things go wrong. So it is a key element within the supply process. It confirms the price, the quality, the working relationship between the two parties, when stuff will be delivered, how it will be delivered, the timeliness of that. It's interesting to compare this slide, which I did a few weeks ago when we talked about doing this session, with some of the things that have happened certainly in the UK in the last few weeks with the vaccine supplies and some of the difficulties that we've been encountering. But I'm trying not to go there today. So there'll be an agreed throughput, or there should be an agreed throughput for goods when you're going to get them, when the service is going to be supplied, when the work will be done. And so overall, a contract, the real benefit is supports the organisation's achieving its delivery objectives, and probably its policy objectives, because you can build in there things like sustainability, core procurement policies, how goods are sourced, how goods are recycled, and so clearly the contract can encompass all of that. Next slide, please. With a single order, just a straight purchase order, it's still a contract, and sometimes we tend to forget that it is still a contract, and it confirms some of the key things, that the price, quality of the item or the product or the service, when it's going to be delivered, when it's going to happen. Probably less security and less focus on working relationships. But as I said earlier, it is still a contract. So it still supports your overall service delivery and your overall objectives, what you're trying to achieve. Next slide. Does the supply chain differ for differing organizations? And although they all have supply chains, they will all have different aspects to their supply chain. So if you're a buyer or a client, whether we're talking about a government department, whether a public body or a commercial business, it's the supply chain sets up that network between you as a buyer and your supplier or your suppliers. And those suppliers will also have their own individual networks in sourcing raw materials, getting skills in, getting equipment in, the logistics of delivery to your organization. So there are going to be a whole range of networks within the supply chain. So there'll be, from the buyer's perspective, the supply chain is going to support your delivery of your services or your product to the people that you sell to or you provide services to. So it's how that supply chain gets the service or the goods to that ultimate end client, the user of your services and your activities. From a from a supplier or a selling organization, it's the whole end-to-end process of designing and making goods, perhaps, or designing and establishing a service. So we're looking at supplying the raw materials through to the manufacture, the logistical aspects to that, the distribution, right through until they reach the buyer, the client, the first bullet on this slide. Also, from a supply perspective or a seller's perspective, it factors in credits like returns for gas cylinders if you're selling gas, or in the old days milk bottles, they were returned. Probably not so much nowadays, although there is a house in my street, they still have a milkman and they still get glass bottles delivered.
I've not seen a milkman in years. Literally don't see them anymore, do you?
See, I live in the country.
True.
Also, from a supplier perspective, particularly, although not exclusively, there's the people factor. And one key part of the supply chain is getting the people, the right people in the right place with the right skills to either provide a service or construct or manufacture. So it's about sourcing numbers and skills with people. And it's something that is often kind of overlooked when we think about what is the supply chain and how do we manage it. From a service organization, it is the design and delivery of that service. Again, sourcing, any logistical considerations, and very importantly with a service organization, that people factor, getting the right people and the right skills to make sure that you can provide the service, and maintaining it as well, which is another a very important factor or a very important consideration. Next slide, Andrea, please. Very crudely, very simply, what's the supply chain about? And I put this one together thinking about a lift installation. If you're looking at this from a supplier's perspective, they would go out, they would respond to a tender, they would design the lift car for your premises or a number of lifts for your premises. They would have to source the components, so there is a link there to a number possibly of other organizations. They would construct the car. The logistical element then comes in because that car's got to be delivered. It might be that it is actually constructed on site, but one way or another there's a logistical link, so another spin-off that goes outside the core chain to perhaps another third party with a logistical element to the supply chain. And then ultimately that becomes a lift installation, is put in place, it's tested, it's checked, it's handed over. Can you give me the next slide, Andrea, please? And then from the buyer's perspective, the client looks fairly similar. They would have an outline design, they would have gone out to tender, selected a supplier, made the award, left the supplier to manufacture in accordance with the specification, made arrangements for the logistic aspects, installing on site, testing, checking, handing over, and we get our lift or we get our replacement lift. And then it's up and running. And as I put on the right, it's then got to be maintained. And it's another supply chain because you'll have perhaps the same supplier or another supplier. And then there are parts that they've got to source and regular maintenance, regular checks. So another supply chain would come along. When we think about supply chain, we start to realize quite how complex and detailed the real supply chain is. We tend to think about just working with a one-to-one, you know, the client and the supplier, or the client and the service organization or the works organization. But spinning out from that, there's a whole kind of network or web of additional supply chains or component areas within the chain. And it's that aspect which can go horribly wrong sometimes when organizations perhaps go out of business or fail or can't get parts. And that's when we realize that the supply chain does have a wide consideration and a lot of things that we have to understand. One thing, excuse me, I'd like you to think about perhaps within your organizations is how complex the supply chains are. You know, pick an area, pick an activity, pick a service, but you know, do you really have a handle on the supply chain? And I'd like you to perhaps think about that and put some comments and thoughts in the chat box.
Yeah, please feel free to use the chat box. It's there to use. Yeah, share your comments and experiences in there.
Okay, next slide, please, Andrea. We often talk about managing that chain, and I think it's just worth exploring really what we mean by supply management or supply chain management. Do we know, taking the first point here, do we know really what we're trying to deliver? Sometimes from a governmental point of view, do we really understand, A, who our customers are? And I resisted using the term customers for many, many years while I was a local government officer, but in the end, I think I had to acknowledge that the word customer is really what we're about. We're serving the public. We're providing them with a goods or a service. And so we need to know, we need to treat them as customers, and we need to understand exactly what they want, what they need, and try to focus on how our chain will deliver against that focus. So it's understanding the customer. If you're perhaps a retailer or a supplier, again, your customer base is pretty clear. But do you actually understand exactly what they want? Are you meeting their requirements? How do you know? Do you ever ask? What systems do we have? What technologies, what people, what processes, all part of that overall supply chain? Logistics, I've already mentioned. Innovation. One of the areas that was really, really hit by innovation was mobile telephones. And certainly in I suppose the 90s and maybe the early 2000s, nearly everybody had a Nokia. Nokia missed the curve because they didn't realize that, or whether they did, I'm not sure, but they certainly missed the curve when Apple developed the iPhone. And now everybody has either Apple or Samsung, with Nokia being perhaps still a player, but not such an important player in the field. So innovation, understanding how the market is moving, understanding how you may need to change what you're buying, and trying to achieve continuous improvement. Do we work with our suppliers? Do they work well with us? Is there a good understanding of if you like, the two parties? Because we're all trying to achieve the same thing, really. I know suppliers are trying to make a profit, and we're trying to get the best value for money. But ultimately, they've got to sell their goods, and we've got to provide a service. So together, we're actually working in collaboration to achieve that. Are we able to respond to change? Can we be flexible? Are we very, very set in what we have to have? How flexible can our specification be when external factors hit our ability to supply or our ability to do a piece of work? Do we understand how long it takes to source something? If you need something tomorrow, there's no point in trying to buy something that's got to be specifically manufactured if the lead time is 6 months. So it's understanding that sourcing. So it's, again, that is part of the understanding of the supply chain and what specialist technology is available. Can we do more via computer links like this? Training courses. Most training courses 2 years ago would have been going to a program or somebody coming into the organization delivering a lecture or an interactive session. Within the last 12 months, so much has been done via Zoom or via Teams or whatever. So using technology to try and get best value for our organizations. Next slide, please, Andrea. We also must remember that supply has a global perspective. It isn't just within the UK or within our own nation. Many of the things that we purchase come from far and wide. I know that Britain and the EU are perhaps falling out at the moment, but nonetheless, we have to acknowledge that so many things have a global perspective and a global impact if supplies dry up. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the oil crisis of the 1970s, and it was amazing some of the products that were no longer available or went into very, very short supply because of a shortage of oil. Risk. Again, we can do a whole session on risk, but risk management is a really, really key thing in terms of the supply chain, and understanding what risks there are, just highlighting them can give us a much greater handle on how we manage the overall supply chain process. Visibility, I think we got to be have a kind of 360-degree awareness of going forward, looking back, all the component parts within the chain and how the chain can create value for us. If we change this, can the supplier respond? Can we do things better, more cheaply? get a better product for the same value, for the same money. And communication, it's absolutely key that we have channels of communication throughout the supply chain. I think inclusivity, it's important that we understand that that all parties within the chain are really vital to establishing and maintaining good supply chain management. So linking inclusivity with communication is important, and of course sustainability. It's very often an organisational policy to pursue a sustainable a process and a sustainable policy. And so, do we know how the component parts within the chain meet sustainability criteria? Are we checking that? Do we ask that at the outset? So it's thinking about how sustainable the whole supply chain is, and latterly, does it meet what we're trying to achieve as an organization, and are there any elements within there that do not fulfill what we have as a policy within our organization? Next slide, please, Andrea. Again, there's something else for the chat box. Are there any other factors that you would regard as supply chain management? I think I've tried to cover them all, but it would be useful to know whether anyone has thought about anything else. I haven't specifically put people in. I've put them under systems, but nonetheless, people is a very, very important element of supply chain management. Why is it important? Facilitating delivery of what you're trying to achieve as a business, and understanding better that relationship between you as a buyer or as a client and the supplying organization, whether it's a supplier, a service provider, a works contractor, or whatever. So it's getting a better handle on how we need to work together and what the relevant parties are trying to achieve. Important also to understand how the supply chain works, because it can help in overall planning for what we're trying to do in the future, and also for the suppliers themselves to understand what we may be buying in the future. So changes in demand, or is there any change in demand for the future for goods, services, works, our requirements, and how the suppliers can respond. Next slide, Andrea, please. And giving us a better understanding of the key parts of the chain, which I've covered previously. So what are the deliverables? How does the logistics work? What special technology do we have to think about? The people factor, pressing that button once again. Cost and price. Something that I'm just going to have a sip, excuse me.
No, go for it. I'll do the same.
Something that came out fairly early in the lockdown this time last year were organizations that were believed to be putting products into shortfall and then trying to hike the price. So we need to have very clear contracts, very clear arrangements on costs of products, costs of services, and whether there's a rise and fall clause in the contract. Who are the end users? What third-party subcontractors or suppliers for the suppliers are there in the chain? Do we know about those? Do we need to know about those? We certainly can't manage them. There was no feeling on my part that we need to manage them, but certainly we need to understand the whole end-to-end chain and the if you like, the links that go off from our prime contractors. And who are the suppliers of raw materials? Again, there might be a subcontractor to a main supplier. Who do we contract with, and what do we need to understand? Next slide, Andrea, please. I wanted to then just mention relationships. We in procurement or in contracts, the contract would be one client generally, and one supplier, or it might be multiple suppliers, but it's usually between two parties. I've said one client generally. It might be that we have a collaborative arrangement with a number of government departments or a number of local authorities, or a mixture of that. So it could be more than one client, but there will be a lead. Somebody will have to take the lead. So it's a client and supplier relationship. Certainly, as a client, we cannot possibly manage all of those businesses within the supply chain, but we need to be aware of them, and we need to know how our contracted supplier or our contracted service provider is managing that linkage within the chain, because we need security. We need security of supply, we need security of product, we need security of cost and price. We also need to understand how the chain works in terms of the people factor. We need to ask questions about how they will get the skills, how they will get the people in place, what key financial considerations there are. We don't want to go into contract with an organisation that is in hock to the bank, or is likely to be financially unsound. And work planning. Are they able to accommodate our requirements? Are we giving them too much work in too short a time, or too great a percentage of work? So it's about work planning with the suppliers in order to achieve our organisational objectives and targets. And that, of course, is one of the key reasons why we have to go through some kind of due diligence checks at the tendering stage, or even pre-tendering. I was going to again ask you to consider putting something on the chat box. What sort of supply chain questions you ask when you do due diligence? I have to admit that way back in the 90s, I don't think we ever asked questions about how the supply chain works, and what continuity for supply and service and people we were likely to get. But we learned very quickly. In fact, you learn by your mistakes. So it's about those due diligence questions. What sort of questions might you be asking to completely understand and cover your supply chain, to make sure A, it's going to be sound, and B, it achieves what you're trying to achieve. Last bullet on this page is about reputation, and I think it's important that we understand how reputation can severely damage a company, a business, or a government department. Especially with the pressures these days from the traditional media and, of course, social media. So reputation is a key area to be aware of and to understand. Next slide, please, Andrea.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need to understand how the supplier evidences their supplier relationships in order to achieve continuity of supply, continuity of service. Again, it's upping that awareness of the broader supply chain considerations. What are our priorities within a supply chain? What do we value? What do our suppliers value? And what do our end customers value? So it's bringing those three together and trying to understand the key value considerations for all the parties within the chain. And I've said on the last bullet, the answers could be varied. It could be that cost is highly important for us as a buyer. Service could be highly important for the end users. Quality could be important for end users, or us as a buyer, or us as a supplier. So reliability, quality, cost, service, or other factors could all come into play. This really helps us to understand the way in which the supply chain works and where some of the risks and potential weaknesses might come about. Can you have the next slide, please? Supply during a crisis. Well, certainly the recent COVID crisis has given us a steep learning curve in some cases. And what have we learned? I think there are a number of things that we've learned, or we should have learned. The first one is do we understand the weaknesses? Are there any weaknesses in our supply chain, and have they been shown up during the crisis? Are we right to be tied into a single supplier, or should we think about multiple suppliers? Is it realistic to have alternative sources of supply? In some cases, it doesn't work. I appreciate that. This is not, you know, a one size fits all, but some areas we may need to think about. For example, maintenance work or supplies, multiple supplies, where you're going to need millions and millions of items. You can certainly think about using more than one supplier to spread the burden. Long-term supply, certainly this is something that we've long gone for in the UK and Europe. And across the States as well, long-term supply or service contracts to give you that continuity, to give you that confidence that, excuse me, you should be able to achieve your organizational objectives. Backup stocks, this is something that came to light in the early days, probably about this time last year, that where there were backup stocks, either they didn't then meet the new requirements and the new regulatory objectives, or they were past their sell-by date. So if you're having backup stocks, where do you keep them? How do you use them? Do you rotate them? Are they a realistic option for organizations? So having a big buffer stock, is that really a practical thing to do? And of course, you tie up funds as well by having backup stocks. So can you have backup stocks within a supplier so you have a more generous call-off arrangement? Can we work differently? Can we do things differently? Can we soften or harden a specification? And if we do, can the suppliers respond? And it might be something worth discussing with suppliers. How can they do something which achieves the same objective, but use manufacturing differently, delivering different kind of service? So can we work differently, or can we change our spec? But certainly you can't realistically do it midstream, mid-contract, without a negotiated arrangement or without some improvement clause within the contract. Can suppliers accommodate fluctuations in demand, whether peaks or troughs? And this again has come to light during the recent crisis, where some suppliers just could not accommodate more work or could not sustain their business when work dropped off. We all know a lot of the implications and impacts that have come about in the last year. So it's about making sure we've got that communication going with all elements, with all organizations within that supply chain. And do we have enough flexibility within procurement regulations? It's quite likely, if we're looking at government departments, it's quite likely that a special dispensation will be given under emergency powers. But where that hasn't happened, are we being stymied by our procurement regulations to go for a more flexible approach to get through special circumstances? I'm pretty sure that all the procurement, sort of national and international procurement regulations that I've seen have emergency powers in there, but it might be worth considering, do we cover these? Another point that I haven't put on this one is really delivery schedules. I did mention it earlier, but I think it's important to understand exactly when, how, and why deliveries need to be factored in to a contract. It's a key aspect of contractual arrangements, and it's certainly worth making sure that a delivery schedule is part of the contract. Something else to consider for the chat box: how do you cover all of these points within the normal procurement arrangements? It's certainly worth thinking about. Any questions or thoughts on that be gratefully received. Andrea, another slide, please.
Yeah.
I've got a few examples that I I wanted to just draw attention to. What could go wrong with the supply chain? Well, delays in sourcing supplies of PPE, or suppliers wanting to increase prices significantly when demand went up. Again, a number of these were covered by pretty resilient contracts, having a firm pricing policy. So that's, the red is the answer to the bullet point, really. Items not to specification or not forming to a standard requirement when it was actually delivered. Couldn't sample because of lockdown. Was due diligence questioning conducted, even remotely? So it's worth making sure that you've got sampling arrangements set up, or effective due diligence to try and make sure that any substandard equipment or substandard material can be rejected and in fact not provided in the first place. Another slide, please. The next point I wanted to make, that suppliers possibly have gone out of business. So do we have a risk assessment process to understand how we get around that should that happen? Can we work closely with the supplier, perhaps to try to make sure that we can support them through the troughs of purchasing their goods or services, to try to make sure that they're able to continue to trade? And I know that on a national government basis, lots of support has been given to some small businesses or businesses that have felt the effects of the recent slowdown in the economy. The fractured chain. This is where a key part, perhaps a component supplier, goes out of business. So understanding the whole chain. Do we understand the whole chain? Do we know what goes into the whole chain? So do we have a proper risk policy, and do we conduct due diligence on the suppliers, and do we get our suppliers to conduct due diligence on their part of the network? How do we check about continuity? And if there is a fracture, under our risk assessment, do we know how we can plug the gap, how we can plug the break? Again, this is not a one size fits all. I readily accept that, but I'm just trying to highlight some of these key questions and key things to think about. Reputational damage. Sometimes this is just as I've said here, just a bit of a flurry that you get headlines for a few days and then just goes away. But sometimes it doesn't. And I've highlighted a couple of examples on the next couple of slides. If you would, Andrea, please, next slide. Some of you, if you're based in the UK, you might remember some of these. A company called Boohoo. They were providing clothing to either shops or retail outlets or selling online, and they suddenly found that they'd got lots of workers on one of its third-party suppliers who were facing modern slavery investigation, were badly paid, weren't working in COVID-friendly conditions, but were also told to carry on working. Boohoo were unaware because they said, well, it's a third party, it's not us. But they were basically unaware. They hadn't investigated who their suppliers were, who the organisations were, what sort of working conditions they had, what their pay rates were. They tried to say it was nothing to do with us, but you can see their share price took a massive dip within 2 days of the news breaking. The Daily Mail last year, they donated face masks to the NHS from a Chinese factory that were using unskilled labour practices, poor payment, poor conditions. The impact there was one of these media storms. Few headlines for a couple of days, and it just went away. It certainly didn't impact effectively on the Daily Mail. The NHS, of course, I don't know if, I can't even remember if they were able to use the face masks, but they certainly, it was certainly a bit of poor work by the paper. Next slide, please, Andrea. Two more quite key reputational examples on this one. Some years ago, you may remember there was this massive explosion in the Gulf of Mexico, which I'm not making light of because there were fatalities. But the environmental damage, the tourism damage, the economic damage in the region was severe. BP's reputation in the US went really downwards, and a number of other businesses that were connected with BP were hugely impacted. The financial burden to BP, you can see it was estimated to cost them somewhere in the region of $200 billion, and a huge drop in their company value on the share price as well. So reputational damage doesn't always impact straight away, but it can knock on quite quickly. And then the Biffa Waste Management Company, they were involved in a case earlier this year of trafficking and slavery. They've denied it, but nonetheless, it's made the press, and people will start asking questions. Then, well, how can we be sure, if you work for us, how can we be sure that the people that you're using to provide our waste control and waste management and refuse collection, they aren't going to be suddenly facing, charges of poor working relationships, poor management practices, perhaps people that don't have work permits and so on. So certainly their image, their reputation was damaged, and that case is still to be heard. Can we move on, Andrea, to I'm just aware of the time. We've got about
That's all right. No, it's fine.
What happens if the chain is broken? And this does happen, of course. If it rather depends at what stage the chain is broken, what aspect is broken. As I've mentioned earlier, if you've done that clear risk assessment, you may well have a plan B. So the first thing is, can you or your supplier cope if the chain is broken? Does it mean that the goods or services that you were expecting are just not going to happen? They're not going to be there. Can you get somebody else? Is there a reserve business? Ideally, we should be aware of another source of supply, but there are some things that are proprietary and there's only one supplier. So how can we achieve continuity? How can we maintain a service? We need to talk to the supply organization or the contracting organization that we're working with, and they need to talk to us as buyers. And perhaps also we need to be aware of the end user impact. Can we talk to the end users? How are we going to work our way through this? Can we provide a service in a different way for them? Is there an alternative supply product that they can take? So how are we going to work this through? Is it going to be a cost impact? And can we cope with a higher cost if there is a cost impact? Because the chances are, if you have to go to another party, they'll say, yes, we can do that for you, but it will cost you. I'm sorry, we can't do it we can't achieve the previous price that you had from your other supplier. And I know a number of us will have experienced that over the years. If the chain break is critical, it might lead to the contract being frustrated, perhaps a force majeure if it's something that we could not have potentially foreseen whatsoever. Are we able to take emergency action? Do our regulations permit that? Or do we have to get special dispensation to put something else in place? So it's certainly worth considering how we will deal with a break in the chain. And we need to think about it in two ways. Is it the core supplier or the other party in the contract that is breaking the chain, or is it one of their suppliers that's breaking the chain? And what's the impact going to be, and how are we going to handle it? Because the answer might be different. Next slide, please, Andrea. The impact on the deliverables. It's possible that the fracture in the chain or the break in the chain means that we cannot meet our service objectives. It might be also that we can't meet some of our policy objectives as well. And again, it rather depends what the impact is as to how we report it, how we handle it, how we take it forward. So we need to think about those relationships between us as a client and the supplier and their subcontractors or their raw material or component providers, the supplier and their workforce. Do we understand quite how that works? Are they getting the right skills? Are we paying them for skills which we aren't getting or that are in short supply? So do we know how they will make sure that their workforce obligations are going to be achieved? And last but not least, the client and our ultimate end users, the people that we provide goods or services to. Do we have any arrangements within our supply agreement or within our contract to give us any priority? Those of you in the UK will perhaps smile at that. I'm thinking about the AstraZeneca argument that's going on at the moment, where we in the UK, we tend to think that, well, we got our contract in place first, so we should have priority of supply. I don't want to go down that road today, but that's something that might be worth thinking about for the future. In your supply agreement or in your contract, are there any specific priorities that you want to think about building in? So make sure that when you work with a third party or when you work with a supplier, they will perhaps make you their first choice of supply, or any kind of prioritization, how you're going to factor that in. And are there key suppliers in the chain? I've mentioned earlier, whether if the chain breaks, is it the key supplier that's breaking it, or is it one of their third-party suppliers or component suppliers? And what's the impact going to be? So need to understand how that impact will knock on to your ultimate service delivery. Next slide, please, Andrea.
Yeah.
I think we've only got about another 6, so should just be in time. Risk, certainly, it's an area that, as I said here, it's sometimes overlooked. I think it's perhaps unfair to say often overlooked. I think we're much more risk aware nowadays. But without having done a risk assessment on a proposed contract or a potential area of procurement, if you don't do that risk assessment, you could find yourself with some significant problems part the way through if something should go wrong. And similarly, I think the parties that we're contracting with, they need to be aware that we've assessed a risk, and we need to discuss with them how we can work together should such and such a risk that we've identified come about. So again, it's back to that dialogue, back to that communication. As I've said, both areas contribute to these deliverables, whether you're a supplier or a buying organization, and whether you work in the public or the private sector, it doesn't make any difference. They all have these risks within the supply chain and within our general procurement process. So without the risk being assessed, there is a potential for the impact to hit the ability of the organization to deliver its business, perhaps hitting on our reputation. And of course, it also hits the supplier. Can the supplier deliver its core business? Can it have its reputation affected or damaged? Next slide, please, Andrea. On the next one, we're going to just highlight and think about some of the risk, excuse me, some of the risk criteria that we might want to use. And again, these will depend upon the organizations, whether they're highly political, what policies they have, but they could include, and I suspect that there may be others that you'll be aware of, but they could include these areas. So there might be financial risks or operational, contractual risks, if the organization goes broke, out of business, general inherent risk from one party to another. Again, think about the BP one that I mentioned earlier. Compliance with A, your contract and the specification, B, all sorts of regulations that are outside of your direct contract, and compliance by the third parties to the contract, you know, the suppliers, subcontractors, and so on, how you're going to achieve continuity. I always used to ask the question, you know, what guarantees can you give us for continuity of service, continuity of supply, continuity of quality? So thinking about risk regarding continuity. Security of supply, security of premises, if it's a service that's provided on your premises, particularly in the IT field. A lot of need to ensure that sound security to systems and operations is in place. And the social responsibility. If you're a government organisation, if you're using a third party for delivering an activity or providing you with something, there is a social responsibility, both in terms of the quality and the deliverables, and also the social responsibility in trying to encourage perhaps SMEs, employment within particular areas, sourcing within a region. So social responsibility in a kind of broad sense there. The next slide, please, Andrea. Mm-hmm. Areas for review. Do we have supply issues? Have we got a history of supply issues? Have we had examples of the chain breaking and what went wrong? And could any of this have been foreseen? What due diligence do we do when we select or consider suppliers? And what due diligence do we ask them to do as well on their supply grouping? And say, this next set of bullets, does this due diligence include the policies, sustainability, sourcing, third parties, so on and so forth? There are some models that are out there that can be used to support this review process. And in the time today, we really, you know, we haven't got an opportunity to look at them. But it is worth considering the use of models, things like Pareto. I'm sure a number of you will be very, very familiar with Pareto, the 80-20 rule. You know, that probably 80% of your goods and services are provided by 20% of your supply or the supply chain. So very often people use the Pareto rule when they look at the supply chain. They don't look at the whole chain, they look at the key 20%. But there are other specific models that we could look at for you. Let's next couple of slides, please, Andrea, and I think that wraps me up then. Mm-hmm. So in conclusion, I've got 8 points here in conclusion. Procurement today in the 21st century, it's not just about simple buying and selling arrangements and agreements between two parties, or maybe more, but you know, two parties within a contract. I think we have to be very aware that it is much broader, and that we have to start or we have to ensure that we have an overall understanding on the whole of that supply chain. I think if we don't understand or acknowledge supply chain principles, we will eventually catch a cold. Something will go wrong, and we will find that we can't deliver our services or activities that we planned. Reputational damage, I've already mentioned that. So it's important that we have a plan for dealing with reputational damage, how we deal with breaks in the chain. Can we overcome them? Have we done a detailed risk assessment to understand what they might be, how we will deal with them? Next slide, please, Andrea. Mm-hmm. More awareness of the component parts. As I said earlier today, you can't manage all the organizations in the chain, but you need to think about how you would expect others to manage them. So more awareness of those component parts, inherent risk assessment built into our procurement and contracting processes, and then auditing the chain. I think if we have a process where we can look at the, excuse me, the whole chain, or using Pareto, the 20%, the key 20%, it supports how we understand and manage that chain, and we will be much better protected from any issues about problems in delivering what we're trying to achieve as an organization and our operational objectives. And then lastly, using some model, if you're going to do a supply chain review, using one of the models or working with us to look at how those models can help us work through. I mean, they would look at things like social factors, technical factors, environmental, political, people, relationships, and so on. So some of those models can be quite helpful in undertaking a supply chain review. And I think our last slide, Andrea, is the advert, which I think Andrea almost did at the beginning. What else can we offer? I think we can do any of these for you, either for day programs or longer programs. And the second one perhaps should say supply chain review and management, including using models. But we can certainly do stuff on risk for you, SCM, procurement, planning, and so on. That wraps me up.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. And I'm always impressed with how much information that you deliver in such a digestible way within it. Yeah, it's been fantastic. Thank you so much. And there's a lot from that I'm actually going to take away, because I've taken on some new responsibilities in my role, and a lot of that was starting to kind of click in and make sense for me. So thank you.
Good.
So yeah, thank you again. I mean, I know that we have went over slightly over time. As David mentioned, the learning doesn't stop now. If you do have questions, please feel free to send your questions to me and I can forward them on to David. My email address is andrea@civilservicecollege.org.uk. That's Andrea, ANDREA, at civilservicecollege.org.uk. Any questions? There's a lot of take in this morning. Please feel free to reflect on any questions today and forward them on to me later on, and I'm sure David would be happy to answer those for you. Just to let you know that obviously that we do these we try to do these every single week. If you are quite keen to find out what's happening at the college, what webinars we are running, what programs, projects, courses, and so on, please do sign up on our training alerts at www.civilservicecollege.org.uk. And just to let all of our participants know that the next webinars coming up will be with Joan Ryan on the 8th of April, who's to know resilience, managing job stress at home or in the workplace. And after that, on the 20th of April, how to handle hope with our expert trainer, Matt Reno. And last slide. It's not there. I don't know why it's not there. There it is. Stay connected. We are on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. The recording will go on YouTube, but we will send this via email with the slides as well. Thank you so much, David. It was great having you on. Hope to get you back on again.
Thank you.
And yeah, we'll be in touch with you all with the materials in the next few days. So thank you to our participants as well. Have a lovely day, David. We hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you. Yes, well, they're always challenging because it's odd. If you're in a room with a dozen people or 50 people, you see the faces, and but it's always quite difficult talking at a screen.
It is, yeah, but get used to it. We hope to get you back on again very soon. It's been great.
I find myself pointing at the bullets as well, and I go to thinking to myself, "You idiot! They can't see that."
We've had some nice comments in the box already, thanking you.
Thanks. Okay.
Brilliant.